record on this computer. All righty. Okay. So tonight begins the big discussion of Rosh Hashannah and Yom Kippur, synagogue tickets, money, and all those wonderful things. All right. First of all, let's start with a very basic idea. There is actually, in a Mishnah, in the Talmud, it says, Arba Rosh Hashanah. There are 4 new years. Now, the word Rosh Hashanah, Rosh has the meaning of head, literally a head. It can mean the beginning or the chief. So Rosh Hashanah is the beginning of the year, hence the Jewish New Year. So the Mishnah already says that there are different new years in the calendar. The first day of the month of Nisan is Rosh Hashanah as far as counting of the months of the year. So in the Bible, throughout the Tanakh, for the most part, months do not have names. They merely have numbers. The first month, the second month, etc. B'chodesh Hashvi'i, in the 7th month, and the first day of the month, Yom Teruah, they're sounding the shofar. Okay, it won't say Be'echa B'Tishrei in the Tanakh, in the Bible. However, okay, Christina now is with us. However, we do find that the rabbis have already used names for the months of the year, and some of those are actually influenced by the other cultures around. So example, Cheshvan, which is the 8th month, actually derives from a Babylonian designation, Mar Cheshvan. Neither here nor there. So the months are counted from Nisan. The reigns of the kings are counted from Nisan according to the Mishnah, meaning if a man was crowned king on the 30th day of the month of Adar, the next day, the first day of Nisan, he's been king for a whole year. But it's like taxes. You know, if you're born on December 31st before midnight, you have to pay taxes for that year. And it's not maybe fun, but you know, that's the reality. So if you're going to have a kid, make sure if you want the deduction for a child, you have them on the 31st of December, so the expenses aren't there yet. You get the deduction. Okay. So, and a lot of cultures have their spring time as beginning of the year. Okay, so Nisan is also the time of the Exodus, and that's why we find that it is recounted in the account of the first Seder. So there's a certain degree of sense of having a Rosh Hashanah in the beginning of the springtime. The second date given is Echad Ellul, which is the month before Rosh Hashanah as we know it today, is for tithing of animals. Most animals are born before that time, and so you have to tithe the animals and give a portion to the Kohanim, etc. And so if an animal is born before or after that date, just like December 31st for a tax write-off. The first of Nisan is Rosh Hashannah that we know. And then the other one is Shvat, Tu B'Shvat, or either the 1st of Shvat or 15th of Shvat is recorded as the Rosh Hashanah for the trees. If fruit ripens or begins to bud, before the 1st of the month, then or before the 15th of the month, according to Beit Hillel, which is what we follow, that now becomes the Rosh Hashanah, are the taxing years for the fruits. The benefit and the problem of having my library right here is I get to grab things if I want to look at something.
Rabbi,
yes.
Do you mind repeating what was the of the fruit? Which was the month again?
Tu B'Shvat, month of Shvat. There's a minor holiday that we celebrate called Tu B'Shvat. Tu is the 15th of, means the 15th of Shvat. And that's, usually people think of as the holiday of the trees. You might hear it called Jewish Arbor Day. Rosh Hashannah. That's Beit Rosh Hashannah. Yeah, all right, so just to grab the mission, make sure you do it correctly. The reading, it says, so there are four New Years in the calendar. The first of Nisan is Rosh Hashannah for kings, for the counting of the festivals. Festivals. On the first of Ellul is the Rosh Hashannah for tithing of cattle. Rabbi Eliezer, Rabbi Shimon say it's actually on the first of Tishrei. By the way, this is an introduction to Jewish way of doing things. Automatically, we have a difference of opinion. You know, the old line goes, 2 Jews, 3 opinions. Okay, so be aware of that. Okay, then on the first of Tishrei is Rosh Hashannah for the years, for the counting of the Shemitah years, the sabbatical years, for the counting of the Jubilee years, for dealing with certain planting laws and vegetation laws. And the first of Shvat is Rosh Hashannah for the trees, and that is according to Beit Shammai. Beit Hillel says it is on the 15th. Okay, so that's right here in the Mishnah. Anybody doubt me? It was right to started on this page. Sorry. Okay. But you know, if you say Rosh Hashannah to the Jew on the street, they're going to think about the holiday that starts this weekend. Just you should understand that there are different understandings of when various kinds of Rosh Hashannah are. And we also have to understand that biblically, in the Torah, Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur are not really the major holidays in the calendar. The major holidays are the pilgrimage festivals. We're told that we're supposed to come to Jerusalem to celebrate the holidays of Passover, Shavuot, Pentecost, and Sukkot, tabernacles or booths. There is no requirement to come to the temple, an ancient temple in ancient days, on Rosh Hashanah or Yom Kippur. And so really what happens is that Rosh Hashanah becomes associated with the determination of our lives. It becomes a time of judgment. And as it becomes associated with judgment, that increases the solemnity of the day, the emphasis on the day, the entire time from Rosh Hashanah through Yom Kippur, the first 10 days of the month of Tishrei, Aseret Yimei Teshuvah, the 10 days of repentance. Those become, over the course of the centuries, a heightening of the meaning of these days, and therefore they become much more central in the Jewish mind. You know, if you talk to sociologists of religion, most people can only take so much religion. Okay? You have a few holidays, a few major holidays that people will observe. Now, if you think, well, let's look at Christianity for a moment. Now, certainly in the Catholic Church, you have saints' days, and there's all kinds of histories behind those things. But for most Christians, there are 2 days of the year that are really important to them, right? Christmas and Easter. Now, they may go to church on Sunday occasionally, whatever the case may be, they follow the rituals, but if you look at the Christian world in the totality, those are really the 2 days that really have the most impact. And even in secular Western society, that has remained as an impactful part of the calendar. So if you ask the average Jew on the street, what are they going to come up with? Rosh Hashannah and Yom Kippur. Okay, that has become the holidays. If you, when we used to go to synagogues, when God willing this whole business is over and done with and people start attending synagogues again, you will see that even in fairly Orthodox circles, there's a greater attendance to the synagogue on Rosh Hashannah and Yom Kippur. Certainly in the more liberal Jewish world, conservative and reform, there's no question that the synagogue observance is manifest mostly on these 2 times of the year, Rosh Hashannah and Yom Kippur. And that's why many synagogues, in order to pay for the bills, the electricity, the wonderful salaries of the rabbis and the cantors and whomever else they have employed by the synagogue. That's why often, because of the nature of the attachment that people have to these days, many synagogues sell tickets to the shul. People kind of wonder, how can you sell tickets to come to church, to synagogue? Well, again, if we compare it to the situation in the Christian world, where when people come to church on Sunday, you pass the hat, you pass the plate around, and people give money. And there's nothing wrong with that. That's how you raise funds for the work of the church. Well, if we can't do that on Shabbat, right? That is the day of the week when most Jews, the more Jews than otherwise come to synagogue, is Shabbat, and we don't handle money on Shabbat. If you go to a traditional minyan during the week, you often see there's a pushka, a charity box that may be passed around during the weekday service that people put a few coins in. Mm-hmm. But you don't have the massive gathering. And when is the massive gathering? It's a Yom Tov. We can't collect money on Yom Tov. And some synagogues actually do have a space issue, how many people they can sit in the synagogue. And therefore, the idea of tickets to the synagogue, either for members only or to the general public outside of the synagogue membership, to raise funds for the synagogue, that's one way of dealing with it. After all, the lights do have to be paid for 365 and a quarter days of the year. Whatever personnel are employed by the synagogue have to have salaries during the course of the year. Now, there are some minyanim that just spring up for the holidays. If you go drive up and down Bathurst, you will often see advertisements for services of various kinds, some at established synagogues. Some will be that at synagogues that only exist for the holidays. So that's what's all around it. And furthermore, in some synagogues, this is only found pretty much now left in the Orthodox world, they use this period of time to auction off honors for the course of the year. Different kinds of honors that may be available in the synagogue. It's a way of raising funds. I bid $400 to have the honor of lifting the Torah on the first day of Rosh Hashannah. Anybody else going to go for it? 400 once, 400 twice. 3 times it goes, Rabbi Berman, you get the honor of raising the Torah on the first day of Rosh Hashannah. Don't anybody quote me, please. All right. The famous story, I got to have a little joke once in a while. There's a Chaim Yankel goes to the synagogue and he hears his name. He's called up for Hagbah. Hagbah is when they lift up the Torah. The Torah can be very heavy. It's leather. It's parchment. So he tries to lift it up and he almost drops it. Oy, avoy, this whole turmoil. So Chaim Yankel, after that Shabbos, he goes to the gym weekly and he works out and he gets very strong and all of that. The next time he's in the synagogue and he hears his name called out again, he rushes up to the bima, grabs hold of the Torah scroll, lifts it 7 columns wide like this, shows everybody how wonderful it is. The rabbi says, congratulations, but we called you up for an aliyah, to read from the Torah, not to lift it. Okay, so you got to pay attention to what's going on. Somebody likes the joke. You know, I'm at that age when I tell old father jokes, and sometimes my kids laugh at it, and grandchildren laugh at them, or more times they've grown at them. Okay. But that does take place. But most synagogues, and we'll talk about more when we talk synagogue organizations, charge dues. Most synagogues are due-paying institutions. That's how they cover most of their expenses. And some of them, your dues entitle you to a ticket or a guaranteed seat in the synagogue. Some synagogues don't even have tickets and don't worry about it. You know, it depends on the synagogue, but that's what it's all about. It's not a cash grab. It's a necessity for synagogues to function. Right? I'm not doing it this year, but for the last few years, I've served as a rabbi of a small synagogue for the holidays. They have a major service, and they pay me for that period of time that I work for them. I'm not doing it this year, so they don't have to pay me anything. But that's the reality. And they sell tickets, and that's how they raise funds for the course of the year for this small synagogue. Okay. So the fact that Rosh Hashannah and Yom Kippur become so important in the Jewish mind is because they're referred to in passing as Yom Hadin, the Day of Judgment. And the Mishnah says that on this day, all of life goes in front of the Kadosh Baruch Hu. We'll look at it next week when we look at the Machzor in a little more depth at some of the piyutim, pass before God for judgment. Mi yechyeh, mi yamut, who shall live and who shall die, who shall grow rich, who shall grow poor, who shall have settled life, who will be forced to wander, all these kinds of things. And it catches on the imagination, as you can understand. After all, if this is the day you're being judged, you want to make sure you do your best to come forward in the right way. So the liturgy expands, and a lot of liturgical poetry was written for these days with the themes of God's kingship, God's judgment, and that expands upon the service. An ordinary Shabbat morning service depends on how long the rabbi talks and the variations in various synagogues. A regular Shabbat without an especially long Torah portion will take 2 to 3 hours. Okay? On Rosh Hashannah, you can expand it by at least an hour, even for most traditional synagogues. And if you have a choir, in some synagogues they build it up and they don't have choirs the rest of the year, but in Rosh Hashannah and Yom Kippur they have a choir. It all adds time. So starting at 8:30 in the morning and finishing at 1:30 in the afternoon is not unusual in a non-virus year. All right? Most synagogues that are going to have any kind of service when people are gathering are cutting it down to the bare minimum, excluding many passages that ordinarily would have been recited. And cutting back the amount of singing and everything that goes on. That's, what is a result of this COVID-19. I don't know if rabbis are shortening their sermons or not. Rabbis like to talk a long time, so they may not shorten their sermons, may use extra time because they have a little more time available to them. Right? Blame the cantor, he's saying too long. Okay? Rabbis and cantors have that thing between them sometimes. Okay. So, as it were, I'm going to use that expression a lot. As it were, it means don't take it on a completely literal level. but it is symbolic, as it were. And indeed, one of the poems, the Tana Tokef, one of the most powerful passages that I recited a little bit from a minute ago, talks about God opening the book of judgment. And there's the refrain, but Rosh Hashannah yikatevu, on Rosh Hashannah the judgment is written, uv'yom ha'kippurim nichatemu, and on the Day of Atonement it is signed and sealed. So beginning on Rosh Hashannah, we stand in judgment. God looks at us as the heavenly God, the heavenly King, the ultimate judge of all, looks at our deeds, see who's been naughty or nice, kind of thing, writes it down. I always tell people today he probably has a iPad or something, right? He writes it down, but the book is not completely sealed until the end of Yom Kippur, and actually we have a little hedging time after that, according to some traditions. But you've got between now and then to determine your fate. Now, I say as it were, if you take it literally, which some people do, now you understand the role that Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur then can have. So in order to get ready for Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur, we actually begin a month earlier. I mentioned that the first of Ellul was one of the Rosh Hashanahs that talks about for the animals, but on the first of Ellul, which is a 2-day Rosh Hashannah, so the second day Rosh Hashannah, which is the first day of the month of Ellul, the standard Ashkenazic tradition is that each morning and each evening we have a special psalm that we recite, the David Adonai Vishi. God is my light, my salvation. It's Psalm 27. Every evening after the evening service, every morning after the morning service, we recite that psalm. Furthermore, in the standard Ashkenazic tradition, and that can vary a little bit, but the standard tradition is just prior to the recitation of that psalm, we blow the shofar. We blow the shofar, the basic blowing of it, the tekiyah, sharim truah, tekiyah, the basic sounding of the shofar. And from the first day of Ellul until Rosh, oh, I saw a head. There's a head over there. What's the name again? Hello? Christina's little girl there. Okay. Okay.
Sorry, her name is Eva.
Ira? Yeah,
Eva.
I think I read it before, but I'm terrible with names. So, fortunately, most of you got your names written in front of you, and I can see it. That's the one advantage of doing it this way again instead of in class. All right. But of course, Cassia has to have VCN in front of her, so I don't want to call her VCN though. So I wrote VCN down to make sure I knew who Cassia was. Okay. So every day during the month of Ellul, except for Shabbat and the last day of Ellul, we blow the shofar. We don't blow the shofar on Shabbat, and we don't blow the shofar on the last day of Ellul, according to probably the best explanation, is that the blowing of the shofar on Rosh Hashannah is a biblical requirement. And we call that a oraita, which is actually an Aramaic word. It means the law of the Torah. They have to blow the shofar. One of the names of Rosh Hashanah is Yom HaTruah, the day of sounding the shofar. Okay? So that is a mitzvah. And before we perform a mitzvah, we say a baracha. So you will see in the synagogue service, as we'll talk about it, when we blow the shofar on Rosh Hashanah, the first time we do it, we recite a bracha, the blessing. Baruch atah Hashem Elokeinu melech haolam asher kidshanu mitzvotav v'tzivanu lishmat shofar. Lishmat kol shofar, to hear the voice of the shofar. The month of Ellul was understood to be simply a tradition, a minhag that arose. And therefore, it's not obligatory. It's not a law of the Torah. And as a matter of fact, if you missed it, you missed it. It's not really something that is that essential. It is traditional to do, but it's not that essential. So to help distinguish between the blowing the shofar of the month of Ellul, which is merely customary, and the blowing of the shofar on Rosh Hashannah, which is obligatory Torah law, we stop one day before Rosh Hashannah to show there's a difference between the two. There's another explanation, which is a little more of the fanciful kind of explanation. Namely, there is a character that appears in Jewish folklore and tradition, and even in the Bible. He has a couple of places where he appears. A character known as Hasatan. Satan means the adversary. And in the book of Job, you see very clearly he serves as kind of a troublemaker, as it were, but his role is to remind God of human sin. In Christian, folklore and everything, it becomes the Satan. Satan is the Hebrew. It merely means the adversary or the prosecutor. Satan is like the prosecuting attorney. There's nothing evil about a prosecuting attorney, unless, of course, you're the defendant. You're not going to be happy with him. But in our system of law, there's no evil quality to the crown prosecutor. That's their job. That's their role, to bring the evidence. Similarly, in Jewish tradition, Satan becomes associated with the bringing of our sins before God, reminding God of where we've gone wrong. And so there is this push back, as it were, to kind of weaken him. So what does the Satan know? The Satan knows that we blow the shofar on Rosh Hashannah. Actually, one of the explanations, we blow it to confuse him, but that's a different explanation. So if he comes to shul and he doesn't hear the shofar blown again, I missed it. I missed Rosh Hashannah, he says to himself, and he doesn't come back the next day when it really is Rosh Hashannah and they blow the shofar. That's a kind of a whimsical explanation. There is a midrash, one of the rabbinic stories, that talks about the Satan, the accuser, bringing the sins of Israel before God. God sits on his throne, or God has a scale, right? To balance out the good deeds versus the bad deeds, the sins versus the mitzvot. And so Satan comes in and he brings these sins, chataot, puts them on the scale, and the good deeds are still outweighing them. So he runs away to go find some more sins to put on the scale. While he goes, God takes some of the sins off the scale and hides it under his robe. This idea that God wants to forgive, Satan's role is to try and convict, and between the two of them, justice gets done, again, as it were. Okay. So, beginning with the first of Ellul, Rosh Chodesh Ellul, first day of the month of Ellul, running through the end of Ellul, every morning we blow the shofar, except Shabbat and Erev Rosh Hashannah, the day before Rosh Hashannah. As you'll see, if you make it to the synagogue, you listen to synagogue services, this Friday morning, we will not blow the shofar. Okay. Now, in Ashkenazic tradition, again, by the way, we mentioned before, just to remind you, there are two major divisions of Jewish traditions. The Ashkenazim on one side, Jews of Europe, Eastern, Western Europe, versus the Jews of Spain and North Africa, which is usually defined as Ashkenazim or Sephardic, a little more complicated than that, but there are two major traditions of how some things are done that differ. In the Sephardic tradition, already with the beginning of the month of Ellul, they begin reciting special penitential passages, slichot, prayers asking God's forgiveness. The Ashkenazic tradition is the Saturday night before Rosh Hashannah, assuming there's enough 4 days between. We start saying Slichot. The origins of Slichot are early Middle Ages, perhaps, maybe a little bit before that, end of the classical period. Originally, what was the tradition was to get up sometime after midnight and recite these passages, including reciting the confessional, for the sin which we committed before you. A short version of that we do on Rosh Hashannah is Ashamnu, Bagadnu, Gazanu, Dibarnu, Dofi. We are guilty, we have dealt treacherously, we have stolen, we have spoken falsely. Okay? And it is an alphabetical acrostic. They use the 22 letters of the Hebrew alphabet, Aleph through Tav, and use each letter has some kind of averak, some kind of sin associated with it. That's Shamnu, we're guilty. Bagadnu, we've acted treacherously. Each one of those words, Aleph, Bet, then Gimel, Gazana, we have stolen. That's how they do it. One of the issues that people have when they're trying to translate the prayers, like this prayer, for example, how do you translate it from one language to another? It's not always easy. And it's sometimes hard to catch the full meaning of one word in one language versus another. Right? The Yiddish word chutzpah is more than meaning gal or nerve. Chutzpah is, you're really, a real chutzpahnik when you as the story goes, that the man throws himself on the mercy of the court for killing his parents because he's now an orphan. Right? That's chutzpah. So how do you translate it? So I knew, and please thank God he's still alive, one of my colleagues, a senior colleague to me who did a translation of the Machzor many years ago, instead of translating Ashamnu, we are guilty, Bagadnu, we've dealt treacherously, he used the letter A to come up with a sin in English for A. And then B, and then C, and then D. I'll give you the example. Okay, so the way he originally translated, so the original Hebrew would be something like, Ashamnu, we are guilty, Baganu, dealt treacherously, Gazanu, we've stolen. He says, we abuse, we betray, we are cruel, we destroy, we embitter, we falsify, we gossip, we hate, we insult, etc., etc. So what he felt was necessary was to capture the meaning of the prayer rather than translate the words. That's a philosophy, and you can argue one way or the other which is better, which is worse. Right? The more you know of Hebrew, then the better the literal translation is. The less you know of Hebrew, perhaps better the capturing the essence of the prayer is better. By the way, he has for X xenophobic, but later versions of that got rid of the X xenophobic because people didn't know what it meant. And so they came up with something else. I don't know where it is right now. Okay. So that Ashamnu is part of that service. We ask God to hear our voice. We ask God to forgive us. as we begin the process of atoning for our sins. Let's start, though, now with a basic concept. What does it mean when we say sin? Chait. All right, the word chait is what is usually translated as sin. All right, and indeed, in the same translator's work, it says, "We have sinned against you by being heartless." For the sin that we sinned against you. What does that mean to say sin? Now, one of the things to understand, interestingly enough, that the word chait, in a more literal sense, means to miss the mark. I didn't get to where I should have gotten. If you are doing archery, you're shooting at the target. You want to hit the middle of the bullseye. If you don't hit the middle of the bullseye, that's chait. All right? You didn't get where you should have been going. So what do you do when you miss the mark? If you want to be a good archer, you try again. The essence of chait is not evilness. It's missing where you should have gone. And so when we think about what we're supposed to be doing at this time of the year, we're supposed to be looking at our lives and seeing where we didn't meet the mark that we should have aimed for. Sometimes that's how we deal with people. Sometimes that's how we deal with God. And in many ways, well, Rosh Hashannah, Yom Kippur, people see it as the religious aspect of it. Most of the mentions of the kinds of chataim that we have done are actions against people. When we recite our shortcomings, very few of the shortcomings mention rituals. We don't have an al chait for the sin which I committed before you by eating a McDonald's cheeseburger or having shrimp scampi or violating Shabbat. Being heartless, speaking recklessly, open and hidden, offensive talk, impure thoughts, empty confession, on purpose or by mistake, by publicly desecrating the name of God. And there's many different ways that one desecrates the name of God. Not all of them have to do with ritual. If somebody is seen as being a religious person, a pious person, a God-fearing person, and they act in an ungodly way, that's desecrating the name of God. Foolish talk, okay? Slander, bribery, gluttony, arrogance, wanton glances, effrontery. These are, there are many more. It goes through the alphabet 22 times as well in this. Tale-bearing, etc. So the heart of what we're saying about our wrong acts, the chataim that we have committed, are between us and our fellow human being. Jewish tradition speaks of two kinds of laws and mitzvot and sins. Ben adam l'chavero, adam l'makom. Between a person and God, that's ben adam l'makom. Ben adam l'chavero acts between us and another human being. And really, as deeply religious as the meaning of Rosh Hashannah and Yom Kippur is, the majority of the averot, the sins that are mentioned, trespasses that are mentioned, deal with ben adam l'chavero, between one person and another. That's why one of the things that we have in our tradition is that in the days leading up to Rosh Hashannah, and especially the days between Rosh Hashannah and Yom Kippur, We are supposed to ask forgiveness not from God, but from people we've injured. And so, it's the most important relationship there. Requires us repairing the relationship between us and a person that we have injured. Now, there can be two parties to an injury, or there can be three parties. Two parties, me and God. I do something that goes against God. He's the injured party. He has the right to forgive or not forgive. When I injure a human being, another person, that person is part of it, and God is part of it. But God cannot forgive me until I've gained forgiveness from the person I injured. It's like I punched Adi in the face, and I said, Rosalind, forgive me. Well, right, does Rosalind have to forgive me for punching Adi in the face? I have to go to Adi first. I have to get your forgiveness. I don't know where you are actually on this. I see you on my screen over here, so I'm looking there. I don't know how you see yourself on your own screen, right? But that's the beginning of it. The beginning of repairing our relationship with God, which has come about because of a chait, because we've missed the mark, when we have done something to another human being, is to begin the process with the person who has been injured first. Only after we have done that can we turn to God seeking forgiveness. So we find it says that we're required to go to a person and say to forgive me. Once, twice, 3 times. Maimonides, right? I mentioned Maimonides, the Rambam. I'll keep mentioning Maimonides, the Rambam. Will come out of your ears after the end of this year's study. In his law code, the Mishnah Torah, he says you have to do it 3 times. It's based on the Talmud. And if the person who has been injured then refuses to forgive, that person carries the sin. In other words, if I'm going to turn to God and say, God, forgive me for my mistakes, how can I do that if I'm not prepared to forgive somebody else for their mistakes? It's hypocrisy. Only when I'm prepared to forgive somebody else can I ask for forgiveness. And to such an extent, I know it's a little perhaps not so nice, but the Maimonides says, again, it's based on the Talmud, if a person is not prepared to forgive, we suspect whether they're Jewish or not. A Jew is supposed to be somebody who's prepared to forgive, which obviously means if Gentiles are expected to forgive, I guess. Right? That's why I say it's a little, again, these things don't take too close. Although he may have meant it literally. Okay. Now, there may be certain circumstances in which the actions are so horrible that a person can't forgive. Most of the things in life are not like that. If you have one, God forbid, there's a child whose parent abused them, or somebody else was abused by another person. All right, those are the, we're not talking about special circumstances like that. If there's such a situation, you yourself, though, probably would be better off if you can find a way to heal by finding some way of seeking repair. But that's a different case, and those cases have to be dealt with individually. But the run-of-the-mill relationships that we have with people, even our families, can be repaired if both parties want to repair them. And it starts by confession of mistake. If you're convinced the other person is the one who made a mistake, well, sometimes we have to, the story goes that Aaron, the brother of Moses, was ish shalom rodev shalom, a man of peace and pursued peace. And so when he saw that there were two people who had had a quarrel, he would go to one and he said, you know what, the other guy is sorry, but he's ashamed to come and ask you to forgive him. He's asked me to go to you to forgive him. And he goes to the other guy and he gives him the same spiel. The other, he's ashamed, he's sorry to, and the two of them make up. Neither one of them wanted to, but Aaron arranged it. Right? So that's the ideal that we aim for. Can we make it all the time? Of course not. That's why Rosh Hashannah comes every year. We know that people are not going to be perfect. As a matter of fact, the very end of Yom Kippur, the night after Yom Kippur, we say the regular weekday evening service. And as part of that service, we already confess to sins. Who's had time to sin? If you're forgiven on Yom Kippur, which is just over 2 minutes ago, when have you had time to commit a sin? But believe me, people can. It doesn't mean that we go out to do things bad. We're human. We're not angels. The Torah is given to human beings. The Torah is not given to angels. So we prepare for Rosh Hashannah. We prepare for Rosh Hashannah because it's a Yom Tov. We prepare for Rosh Hashannah because we have to make ourselves acceptable to God. And the only way we can make ourselves acceptable to God is if we seek to repair the damages that we've done to others. And that's the essence of Chet. To miss the mark, to cause harm, whether it be to God or to our fellow human being. Okay, so Rosh Hashannah always draws near. This year is going to be this coming Friday night and Sunday, Saturday night, Sunday. Now, when we talked about the calendar, I mentioned one of the unique qualities about Rosh Hashannah is that Rosh Hashannah falls on the new moon. Right? Remember we said that originally they would have witnesses who would go out to see if they saw the new moon. If they saw the new moon, they would go to the court. The court would declare today the first day of the month. But you can't, Rosh Hashannah causes a problem with that. And I won't, not going through all the details. Eventually it was decided by the rabbis. Then Rosh Hashannah is treated in some ways like it's one 48-hour day. Don't ask me why. It's not considered to be 2 days out of doubt. It's like it's one long day. That affects a couple of the rituals. Otherwise, it doesn't really mean much in terms of our behaviors. All right, so now, Rosh Hashannah is a Yom Tov. Now, the difference between Shabbat and Yom Tov is the basic idea of cooking food. In order to properly celebrate the Yom Tov, it was understood that you were allowed to cook on a Yom Tov. So on a normal year, this year the first day of Rosh Hashannah is Shabbat, so it's not normal in that sense. But in a normal year, we can cook on Rosh Hashannah, although you get stuff in advance usually, but you can cook on Rosh Hashannah itself. The rabbis understood you're allowed to transfer a flame. You're not supposed to kindle a flame to start with, but you can transfer a flame. That becomes an issue with lighting your Shabbos candles, the candles on Yom Tov candles after the first night. And just like on Shabbat, we light the candles the first night, 18 minutes before sunset. The second night, as we do in all of the second nights of Yom Tov, we wait till 42 minutes after sunset to light the candles. And in this case, it's also more this year because it's also Shabbat. That's another reason why we have to be careful to light the lights later. But as I said, we don't strike a match or turn on something to start a flame. So we either have candles that are burning the whole time, got 24-hour candles that may be around to light, transfer flame from a gas stove, whatever the case may be for the second night. The bracha, the blessing on normally would be like Sher Kiddushan Mitzvotav Yitzvani Lahadlik Ner Shel Yom Tov, was sanctified by his commandments and commanded us to light the lamps or the candles of the holiday, Yom Tov. This year, because it is also Shabbat, Shabbat always takes precedence. There's a basic concept in Jewish law. Something that is done more frequently usually takes precedence over something that is done less frequently. So this Friday night, when we light the candles, the blessing first refers to Shabbat and then Yom Tov. Asher Kiddushan Mitzvotav is sanctified by his commandments and commanded us Mitzivanu lahadlik ner Shabbat v'Yom Tov. Light the lamps of Shabbat and Yom Tov. The Sabbath and the holiday. Saturday night, it will only be Yom Tov. Secondly, on the first night of Yom Tov, we say Shehechiyanu. Actually, the first two nights of Yom Tov, we say Shehechiyanu. Since, yes?
Sorry, are we still having Havdalah then on Saturday?
Hold that question till later. Yeah, that's a good question. And if I don't say something about it, yell, throw something at me. Okay. So we're still on Friday night. So we say Shehechiyanu. We say Shehechiyanu the second night as well. But because it's one long day, there's a question of whether or not we really should be saying Shehechiyanu. So we try to have a new fruit. We haven't eaten that year for the second night. The Shehechiyanu we have in mind, if we're lighting the candles or we're saying the Kiddush with Shehechiyanu, that is also referring to the fruit, the new fruit. Or if it's worse comes to worse, you can always buy new clothing and wear something new, a new shirt, a new dress, a new suit. And when we wear some clothing for the first time, we're also supposed to say Shehechiyanu. So that's a good excuse to get something new, to get your spouse to buy you something new for Yom Tov. Used to be they say the men to buy their wives something new. So equal opportunity buying now. Okay. Normally, there's a synagogue service. Since it's Shabbat and Yom Tov together, the actual Kabbalat Shabbat, the introduction service for Shabbat, is abbreviated when it coincides with any Yom Tov, whether it be Shabbat or Rosh Hashannah, for example. And then the basic service is not very different. Now, what is different, and here's where I apologize for my singing or lack thereof qualities. The Shabbat, the weekday, and the holidays all have tunes that are associated with the day. So that if you know the melodies, even though the prayer may be the same, if you know the melodies and you walk into a synagogue and you've been on Mars for so long and lost sight of the calendar, you don't know what day it is. If you had the ear, you would know from how it sounds. So like Shabbat, we call the prayer, the Baruch Hu sounds something like Baruch Hu Adon Hashem HaMevorach. The weekday it's a little more plain, Baruch Hu Adonai HaMevorach. Now on Yom Tov, on Rosh Hashannah, often it's introduced with a kind of thing. And Hashem HaMevorach. I'm off the key a little bit, but that's more or less mostly less, what it sounds like. Listen, you hear there's a bit more oomph. a more ornateness, which is associated with Yamim Noraim, the days of awe. And so, by the way, that's another term that we use for Rosh Yom Kippur, Yamim Noraim, the days of awe. Okay? In English, they sometimes call it the high holy days. And throughout the service, the nigun, the nusach is what we call it in Hebrew, has a different nusach to it that is a little bit, or tells you what the holiday is. But the basic service is not very different from the regular Friday night service. At home, well, this year, for example, since it's Friday night, it's going to be almost exactly the same as every Shabbat meal. The only difference is we have passages that we recite that refer to Shabbat. Since the way the timing works here, we're going to be going over the Machzor mostly next week, and that's just going to deal with Yom Kippur more. But let me find the Kiddush here. Too far. Right, so on Shabbat, we just mentioned Shabbat. But on Yom Tov, we mention both of them. So that there will be passages in, usually in parentheses, telling you whether or not you recite it on Shabbat, if the holiday is falling on Shabbat or not. I have it in two different places. Maybe, because it just has the synagogue version of it. I know. Anyway, when we come to the end of the Kiddush, we will say again, Shabbat, Mekadesh Yisrael, Shabbat Yisrael v'Yom Kippurim, Yom HaTruah, or Yom Tov, whatever, depending upon the nature of it, right? Yom HaZikaron. Right, so for here, we say, Baruch Atah Hashem Elokeinu Melech Haolam, Mekadesh HaShabbat v'Yisrael v'Yom HaZikaron. Okay, so Shabbat first, then Yisrael, and then the holiday. Right? The reason for that order is Shabbat comes no matter what we do. Every 7 days is Shabbat. At one stage in history, the rabbinic court, had to declare the new moon. So when Yom Tov comes about, it also has a human aspect to it of setting the calendar. And therefore, the sanctity goes for Israel first, because Israel is sanctified, and through Israel's act of sanctifying the month, it makes it into the holiday. So that is the order that we say. And then after we say that, we will say Shehechianu for the Kiddush. Second night this year, which because it's the end of Shabbat, we don't do Havdalah the way we normally do it. Normally we have a Havdalah candle, we light it, we can blow it out. We don't do that. So normally what we do is we use the Shabbat candles, or the candles that we're lighting for the holiday licht, the holiday lamps, as our source of light. Some people, if they're using wax candles, they'll bring two together so they kind of make it a double wick. If you don't, that's okay too. And so we say, we don't have the whole introduction to Havdalah, but what we do is we say the Kiddush. We then say the blessing over the flame, Morei Ha'esh. We then say the blessing of Havdalah. It's slightly different because instead of saying Ben Kodesh L'chol, signifying the difference or distinguishing between the weekday and the Shabbat, we say between Kodesh and Kodesh, between the holy and the holy. After that, we say the Shechianu and drink the wine. What we don't have is besamim. There are no spices on the second night of on the Rosh Hashannah when we're saying Havdalah. At the end of Yontiv and end of the Yom Tov, we say Havdalah again, but then it's only Brei Pri Hagafen and the blessing of Havdalah. We don't have the flame or the spices. Okay. The meal traditionally, again, like always, you want to have a nice meal. The setup is the way it is on Shabbat normally. 2 challahs on the table. There's a tradition of using round challahs instead of the twisted challahs. Very clear symbolism of the roundness of the year. Some people follow a tradition of having special foods that we eat. I don't usually, but some follow. There are different simanim, foods that we eat to symbolize a good year. For example, the head of a fish, and not the tail. Anybody needs fish heads. You can find different. Some of the traditional Machzorim have a list of those foods. We also put honey on the challah, and before we consume it, and after we take a bite of the challah with the honey, we usually add the words "Hirat Sam Lefnecha," that should be your will before you, Lord of God, King of the Universe. Maybe variations there. Yeah, Shana Tova Umetukada. This should be a good and sweet year, symbolized by the honey. There's also a tradition: take an apple and dip it in honey, and then we say the blessing for the fruit of the tree, and eat the apple with honey, and say the Hirat Son for Shana Tova Metuka as well. And on the second night, we try to have a fruit that we haven't had this year, so we can say the Shechianu on eating this fruit, and so the Shechianu is really is also on the fruit case this rather than the second night of Rosh Hashannah with the various halachic implications. Now, the rest of the evening, it's like any Friday night, any Shabbat. Traditionally, again, we don't go out in the car, we go driving around, we don't do work, we relax. Although if it weren't Shabbat, we're allowed to cook. Okay. The next morning, as I mentioned earlier, and we'll go over some of the piyutim next week, the service traditionally was much longer. And there are differences of opinion if that was really correct. Some of the piyutim, some of these liturgical poems that were added were frowned upon by some of the rabbis. And so some synagogues do all of them. Some synagogues abbreviate them. I'll try to remember to point out next week. Some of them are even abbreviated already in the Machzor that we have. The prayer book that we use during the week or on Shabbat is usually referred to as Sidur. Sidur means order, right? The Shabbat Sidur, the weekday Sidur. On Rosh Hashannah and Yom Kippur, and actually on the holidays as well, but certainly everybody knows on Rosh Hashannah and Yom Kippur, the work is usually referred to as Machzor. Machzor really means the same thing. It means an order of the service. But because of all the special piyutim and things that are added to the service, it was a tradition to have a separate prayer books for the Yamim Noraim for Rosh Hashannah Yom Kippur, even if you didn't have it for the holidays. Sometimes there are more than one volume, sometimes in one volume, it depends. And different synagogues in town have different machzorim that they use these days. There's not one machzor that's used in the conservative movement anymore at all. Excuse me. Now, the first day of Rosh Hashannah is Shabbat. And since it's Shabbat, there are some changes in the service. One of those changes is the number of people who are called up to the Torah. The number of people being called up to the Torah is an aliyah. Aliyah means to go up. Traditionally, in the middle of the synagogue would be what was called the bima. The bima is a raised platform. And on the top of the raised platform would be the reading table. And people sat around that reading table. And the Torah would be read from there. So an aliyah means going up. So you're going up to the Torah to recite the blessings for the Torah reading. On a weekday, Monday and Thursday, Saturday, Shabbat afternoon, we traditionally have 3 aliyot to the Torah. 3 people are called up to the Torah. The first one traditionally was go to a Kohen, second to a Levi, and the third to Yisrael, an ordinary Jew. On Rosh Chodesh, when a day that we have a Musaf, but it's not a full-fledged holiday. So that's Rosh Chodesh, it's Chol HaMoed, the weekday parts of the holiday. We'll talk about that in a couple of weeks. We call 4 people to the Torah. Kohen, Levi, and then 2 Yisrael. On Rosh Hashannah, on a normal Rosh Hashannah, on a normal Yom Tov, we have 5 aliyot to the Torah. That does not count the extra aliyah, which we call the maftir aliyah. All right. On Yom Kippur, it is now 6 aliyot to the Torah, plus the maftir aliyah. Shabbat, it's 7. So by that hierarchy and number of people called up to the Torah, you see a sense of hierarchy of the sanctity of the day. So that Yom Kippur is considered to be secondary to Shabbat. So similarly, Rosh Hashannah. So Rosh Hashannah normally would be 5 aliyot. On Rosh Hashannah that falls on Shabbat, it's the same Torah portion, but it's divided into 7 sections instead of just 5. And interestingly enough, what do we read on the first day of Rosh Hashannah? Excuse me. Sorry about that. We don't read the story of creation. We read the story of the birth of Isaac. And it opens up, Amar, God remembers Sarah as he had said, and she is pregnant and she gives birth to Isaac. And we're told about strife that exists within the family, with the expulsion of Hagar and her son Ishmael, all these kinds of very difficult story that we read about. And then we have a special haftarah. First, we call up a person called the maftir aliyah, is the person who is going to read the haftarah, the prophetic reading. And then for the prophetic, for his aliyah, we have a second Torah scroll. And from that second Torah scroll, we read about the holiday of Rosh Hashannah, Yom Teruah. Where's the maftir? All right, on the 7th month, on the first day of the month, you shall observe a sacred occasion. You shall not work at your occupations. You shall observe it as a day when the horn is sounded. You shall present a burnt offering of pleasing order to the Lord, etc. So we read about the special sacrifice, the special aspect of Rosh Hashannah, which includes Yom Teruah, the day of sounding of the shofar, the sounding of the horn. The Haftarah, the passage we read, is a wonderful passage. It's a story of Hannah. Hannah was the mother of Samuel. You may have heard of 1st and 2nd Samuel in the books of the Bible, Shmuel. And just like Sarah has problems having a child, so too did Hannah. And so she prays to God for a child. Her prayer serves as the paradigm for Jewish prayer, according to the Talmud. And she too is answered with a child. So we want, and part of this is we want God to remember us on this day. So these ideas that God remembers Sarah, God remembered Hannah, serve as a connection thematically. The second day of Rosh Hashanah, we read about the near sacrifice of Isaac, Akedat Yitzchak, the binding of Isaac on the altar. And again, his sacrifice, near sacrifice, serves as a paradigm for us in terms of how we are to regard our responsibility to lead a Jewish life. The Hot Maftir is the same for that day, and there's a special Torah reading from the prophets for the Haftarah that day. Is from a passage from Jeremiah about how Israel found favor with God in the wilderness. Now, since it's Shabbat, we omit what is many people's most favorite part of the service. We do not blow the shofar on Shabbat. Now, it's very clear that originally the shofar was sounded on Shabbat. We know that the temple service required the blowing of the shofar for certain things. We know after the destruction of the temple, some things that were associated with the temple were no longer continued. And so the service, even if they blew the shofar on Shabbat in the temple, was not, the rabbis ruled you can't do it outside of the temple. The Gemara, the Talmud explains, it says they were worried that somebody might carry it around in the public thoroughfare to ask him how to blow the shofar. Very poor explanation as to why you can't do it on Shabbat. And I don't have what I think is an adequate answer as to why, but it was a rabbinic enactment. The rabbis forbade it. So those synagogues that observe 2 days of Rosh Hashannah, the shofar will not be sounded on the first day of Rosh Hashanah on Shabbat. There may be synagogues, some Reform synagogues do blow the shofar because they only observe 1 day of Rosh Hashanah. But in the traditional world, we don't. Second day of Rosh Hashanah, that's when we will blow the shofar. Now, the shofar has, according to the rabbi's reading of the Torah, 2 sounds, tekiyah and truah. Did you have a question?
Yes, I did. We read, and you just mentioned that Reform synagogues only have 1 day of Rosh Hashanah.
Yes.
Why is this?
Well, if you remember, they only have 1 day of all the holidays. The rationale, which is given in the Talmud, and the debate that was in the Talmud, they decided to go against. Okay? There are conservative synagogues that only have 1 day Yontif. Most have 2 days of Rosh Hashanah. But you will see when you get to the synagogues, the second day of Rosh Hashanah is also less attended than the first day. And
Okay.
yeah, go on.
What's the difference between Reform and Reconstructionists? Because I'm mostly unsure.
I'm not sure today anymore. You really would have to ask the Reform rabbis and just briefly, because we'll talk about the different movements in the spring. Reconstructionism grew out of the conservative movement. Originally, in many ways, it was more traditional than the Reform movement, but in some ways, the theology of the Reform movement was more traditional than the theology of Reconstructionism. In a nutshell, the early Reform movement, anyway, believed that God gave the Torah to Israel. He gave the laws of the Torah, the ritual laws, were bound to the time and place in which they came from. They were not necessary to observe them today. But there was a very God-centric, liberal theology. Reconstructionism, in a sense, rose out of sociology. The founder of Reconstructionism, Mordechai Kaplan, thought of Judaism as a religious civilization. Judaism was the what Jews did. It was the total culture of Jews. But culture is not necessarily God-given. For Mordechai Kaplan, God was a power for good in the universe. He didn't believe in a personal God in that sense. Now, both movements have gone through lots of changes. And I'm sure Mordechai Kaplan would not recognize the Reconstructionist movement as it exists today, because the Reconstructionist movement today has been highly influenced by a lot of mysticism and modern mysticism in some of their things. And he was very much not into mysticism in any way. And neo-Hasidism, and et cetera, has affected both the Reform and the Conservative and the Reconstructionists to various extents. Okay, so I can't really give you a much better example. Yeah, I don't personally hold for either one, so I can't really give you my reading of them as a personal reading of them. I can simply say that the basis of Reconstructionism was originally sociological. It develops out of the conservative movement. It was less God-centered. It was very much people-centered. The Reform movement was much more God-centered. It was a reaction to Jewish challenges to Jews especially in the 19th and early 20th centuries, and in many ways sought to emulate the Protestant church. It was a conscious effort by them because of what they thought would be beneficial to maintaining Judaism. But today there's a lot of overlap with all the different movements. Okay. Yes.
I thought there were 3 sounds for the shofar.
Well, here I was going to get to that. Okay. So the problem is, there was a debate. What is truah? As always, right? We just got to argue about everything. Was it 3 shortish blasts, or was it 9 shorter blasts? So the tekiah, everybody agrees. The tekiah is 1 long blast. Tekiah. But was it shvarim? Shvarim was da, da, da. Or was it da, 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 da? So what do we do today? Sort of, we don't make any mistakes, we do everything. So on Rosh Hashannah, you will have tekiah, shvarim truah, tekiah 3 times. Then you will have tekiah, shvarim, truah 3 times. Then you'll have tekiah, truah, tekiah 3 times, but the last tekiah will be a tekiah gedolah, longer blast. So if it was really, that way we make sure we make no mistakes. Follow all the possibilities. Furthermore, the tradition rose that we're supposed to sound the shofar 100 times. Now, tekiah is 1, truah is considered to be 2, shvarim is considered to be 3, and tekiah makes 4. All right, so or tekiah shvarim is the 2, is 1 together. So anyway, so by doing it, we have 10 blasts, tekiah shvarim truah tekiah. So we have 10 of those. 10 of the neck of tekiah shvarim, 10 tekiah, that's 10. And then tekiah shvarim, truah tekiah, plus the tekiah gedolah, that's another 10. So that's 30. Now, when do you do the other 70? A Sephardic tradition, which has been adopted by many conservative synagogues, is during the silent Amidah. At certain points, we sound the shofar 10 times. Tekiah shvarim truah tekiah, tekiah shvarim tekiah, tekiah truah tekiah. Okay? So we do that 3 times. That gives us, now we've had 60. During the repetition of the Musaf Amidah, we do the same thing. Tekiyah Shvarim Teruah Tekiyah, Tekiyah Shvarim Tekiyah, Tekiyah Teruah Tekiyah. Thus giving us 90. And that leaves only 10 at the end of the service. Usually done at the end of the Kaddish after the Musaf. In some synagogues, they don't blow the shofar during the silent Amidah, but only during the repetition, and therefore they have to do 40 at the end. That's the tradition. It's developed over the course of time, and that's what is done in traditional synagogues, 100 blasts of the shofar. All right. And if you go to a very strict medactic synagogue where the rabbi is really careful, he knows that according to the law, at least in theory, the tekiyah is to be as long as 3 shvarims. And the truah is the same length of time as the 3 shvarim. All right? So they may sit there with the watch. Nope, you took too long, or you took too short, or whatever it may be. And the guy has to do it over again. All right? I've had to correct a shofar blow on occasion because they missed something, but that's, I believe me, I don't check the timing on it to make sure that they make all of that. Traditionally, the person who serves as the shofar blower, the person who serves as the cantor, the shliach tzibur, the person who serves as the Torah reader have a very important, vital role in the service. And traditionally, you were supposed to select individuals that had, first and foremost, the religious merits to serve in that position. Secondly came voice. Today, it's mostly voice. But to serve properly as the shliach tzibur, as the cantor, you have to know the proper nusach. You have to know the way the service is chanted. And that's why a lot of places, even if they don't have a full-time cantor, will hire somebody for the holidays because they know that it requires more knowledge than one might have normally. And so there are people who otherwise don't serve as chazanim, but they take pulpits for the holidays. They've been trained, even if they're normally just a lay person, what have you. There's also tradition for the officiants to wear the kittel. The kittel is a white robe. It is worn traditionally as part of the garb of burial. It's also a garb that is put on in traditional Orthodox circles at a wedding. The groom puts a kittel on for part of the wedding ceremony. Some synagogues, the rabbis and cantors might wear more normal clerical robes, clergy robes. And in some synagogues, a lot of the men will wear a kittel. On Yom Kippur, in the very traditional circles, all the men wear a kittel. Many of the women will dress in white for their garments. Not as much today, I think, as they used to be. So it's usually a longer service, and the sermons are usually longer. The rabbis usually assume there's going to be a longer, more involved sermon. They spend more time on preparing for Rosh Hashannah, Yom Kippur. And then by the time the afternoon comes along, you go home, you go have your meal. Normally on the afternoon of Rosh Hashannah, the first day, or if it is this year, it falls in Shabbat, the second day, there's a ceremony called Tashlich. Tashlich goes back to the Middle Ages. People would gather by a body of water, and they would say psalms, and symbolically cast their sins into the water. At some point in history, people started taking bread with them and throwing bread into the water that the fish would eat. Many of the most traditional rabbis frowned heavily on that practice, but it is still followed. But because of that, especially, we don't do it when it's on Shabbat, lest somebody carries bread out in the public thoroughfare when they shouldn't be carrying something. Okay, so then the second night of Rosh Hashannah, we start later because we don't want to start until the 42 minutes after sunset to be sure that that day is over, even though theoretically it's part of the same day. As I said at the beginning, Yom Arichta, one long day. And we make Kiddush, we have the Shechiyanu, and that's where we make sure we have some new clothing or some new fruit to eat that night. The service the next day is very similar. In this case, because Rosh Hashannah will fall on Sunday, the second day. We have the shofar blowing on the second day, which we didn't have the first day. Mincha, the evening service is weekday evening service, followed by Havdalah, which is a very short Havdalah. There are additions to the service during the course of the week that are passages. We'll probably look at them next week. As we get closer to Yom Kippur, this idea again of trying to make sure that we make amends. Yom Kippur night, before sunset, we have the meal before the fast. On Yom Kippur, we're supposed to afflict ourselves. The rabbis understood to afflict to mean you can't eat or drink, you cannot bathe, you can't anoint your body with oils and things like that. You may not join in conjugal intercourse. You may not wear leather shoes. Those were considered to be the affliction of the body. And so from before sunset, Erev Yom Kippur, till 42 minutes after sunset, give or take, depending on synagogue, after Yom Kippur, we do not eat or drink anything. So it becomes a fast is 25 hours, not just 24, really. There is no kiddush for Yom Kippur because we eat the meal before Yom Kippur begins. The Yom Kippur service really begins before lunchtime. Before lunch, there's a tradition to say the mincha service with the confessional. Maimonides says we do that way in case, God forbid, while we're eating our dinner before the fast, we would choke on a bone and die before Yom Kippur without having confessed our sins. So we make sure we have a confessional before mincha, and then therefore it's before dinner. We eat our dinner, we go to shul before sunset, and then we have what is called kol nidre. Now, kol nidre is well known to people. You guys see the jazz singer version? Any of the versions of the jazz singer? Anybody know what I'm talking about? Oh gosh, not even the most recent one with what's his name? Oh. The jazz singer was the first talkie. It was made with Al Jolson. The storyline is of this young man whose father is a cantor. The son kind of goes away from him, becomes a jazz singer, hence the name. And his father is sick, or his father dies, what have you. And there's nobody there to do the Kol Nidra service, and so the son comes back to the synagogue and chants Kol Nidre. Right? And so that becomes the big song, and that's part of what was actually heard. The Al Jolson version of it, of Kol Nidre, was Al Jolson singing Kol Nidre. It was remade in the early 50s with Danny Thomas. It was, actually there's a Jerry Lewis version of it nobody's ever seen. And then there was a more recent version done by, I got it somewhere here. Modern pop star, another Jewish guy. Most of them are Jewish except for Danny Thomas. He was the only non-Jew who played the role. And his version of it, again, the storyline's the same with a little bit of variations on it. But the whole point is that the center musical piece is Kol Nidre. Okay? And so the wording of Kol Nidre is actually very prosaic. It's a legal formula. All the oaths and vows that we have taken should be nullified, null and void, from this year until the next. Actually, there was a bit of a debate as to be this year and from this year last year, from last year till this year, or this year till next year. We usually say from this year to next year. Neil Diamond, by the way, was the last version of the jazz singer. Good thing I can go quickly on Dr. Google. And really, it's prosaic. It's the actual words are, most people have no idea what we're saying. And it's the nigun, the sound, the music to it, which has made it such an important piece of liturgy. It's a liturgy by the authority of the court and high, by all vows and oaths we take, all promises and obligations we make to God, between this Yom Kippur and the next, we hereby publicly retract in the event that we should forget them, and hereby declare our intention to be absolved of them. But actually, it has several different terms for different kinds of vows that we can make. And we say they're null and void between us and God, because that was a big thing, and people thought Jews were releasing themselves from any vow they had. That's not the case between us and God. But it's very formal. You take at least 2 Sifrei Torah from the Ark. So 2 people at least stand on either side of the Chazan, the cantor, thus making a court of 3. The minimum number for a court is 3. He takes the Chazan takes permission from the Yeshiva Shamal and the Yeshiva Shamata, the court on high and the court below, to allow even sinners to join together in the service. And then he chants Kol Nidrei V'chiruzei V'kinuyei V'kinuzei V'dididei Yai-dai-dai and then everybody goes and joins in from time to time, what have you. So that music is set in people's minds, and that's become really the part and parcel of it. It's done 3 times. Traditionally, judicial statements are made 3 times. So that's why it's done 3 times. The men in those synagogues where women wear talit, all of Yom Kippur, starting at the service. Normally, we just wear the talit in the morning service. Sometimes those conducting the service will wear talit, but normally the congregation does not wear talit at night. But on Yom Kippur, we start before sunset, so we have the talit on, and we leave the talit on throughout the service, and then next morning we put it on again all the way through the end of the liturgy. We will go over that a bit more next week because for Yom Kippur. Just to take note, if you get to the synagogues, you get to look at the Machzor, you'll see that a great deal of the poetry is going to be playing off the idea of God as king. The king in the ancient world was the ultimate judge, the last court of review. And so therefore, very clearly, God stands in as the king most high. He is the king HaMelech, and therefore he is the ultimate judge. And that's why a lot of the poetry, the piyutim, will play off that concept of God as king and God of judgment, etc. We will see that that theme is also on Yom Kippur, with also the addition of the ideas of atonement and seeking forgiveness. Okay, any questions? All right. As you know, after I leave you guys, I will post this on YouTube. You can take a look at it if you feel so.
Rabbi,
Yes. I'm sorry. What did you say?
where on YouTube? Where on YouTube?
It's
Where is it on YouTube?
Introduction to Judaism, 2057. I mean, sorry, 5881. Isn't that what I put down there? Just a second. I'll double check. YouTube video. Let's see YouTube. YouTube. That's not what I want. Let's see your videos. It's Introduction to Judaism 5778. 81, 5781. My goodness. Here, just a second. I know I'm hiding all of you guys. Here we go. Whoops. Share screen.
Found it.
You found it. That's not it. Inbox. That's not what I want. Oh, it's good. Somebody found it. There we go. Introduction Judaism.
I'm officially subscribing to you, Rabbi.
Okay. So now you can see it's there. See that, everybody? And your pictures are all there. I don't say who you are, although I guess your names are on there. I don't know. Do they show up? Maybe not. They may strip the names off of there. Okay. But you can see my ugly face in the center of each one of them. I actually trim my beard a little bit. It's real difficult. Beard trimming is harder than getting a haircut, especially when you got not much in the way of hair. Guys, let that be a warning to you that they spend more time doing the hair, cutting the beard, and really should charge more money for it because it takes more time. But the barber once said, yeah, but it takes longer to find the hairs to cut on your head versus the ones on your chin. Less follically challenged individuals. Okay, so I wish everybody Shana Tova Umetuka. Have a good, sweet New Year. We'll see everybody next week just before Yom Kippur, and we'll continue then. Okay. Good night, everybody.
Okay, thank you. Good night.
Good night.
Good night.
Yeah, cheers.
Yeah. Okay. Let's get out of this. Good night. Yeah. I can't even figure what I'm doing here. Good night. Good night.